All memoirs require research. Sometimes this research just involves trawling through your brain for memories. However, much of the time it can involve interviewing people, going through family records and documents, reading old newspapers, all manner of possibilities. The research process can take longer than the writing. So if you have a deadline, you need to factor this in. I was commissioned to write a history of the horse in Australia by one of my publishers, and I was given 12 months to complete my manuscript. I spent the first 10 months researching, and it was only after a phone call from my publisher reminding me that I had 2 months left that I started writing. My problem is that I find research so much fun, so interesting, much more fun than actually writing. But at some point the writing has to be done. Here are some research tips based on my experiences. Conducting research almost invariably results in going down wormholes. Even when we start the research process with firm ideas of what we're looking for, we come across unexpected paths, jewels of information that can bewitch us. They also have the effect of having an impact on our preconceived ideas and of structure. So it's important to have a degree of flexibility when researching, to be open-minded. If you're too set in your ways in terms of how you see your work structured, you might reject stories or information, anything at all that doesn't fit this narrow focus that you've got. You'll be doing yourself a disservice, and you'll end up creating a work that does not reach its full potential. And with that in mind, make sure you give yourself enough time to research widely and deeply and to go on tangents. You'll find stuff that will potentially transform the story that you're going to tell. Whether you are researching the background to your family or a place or an event, think behind the obvious for your research. Yes, public libraries are great, particularly state libraries. They're great repositories of books and journals and genealogical collections, and books and newspapers are great sources of knowledge, but your search should not end there. Consider who might have letters that can help you. And libraries have collections of pamphlets and ephemera from different periods in history. And maybe there are people you could interview who were around at times you are covering or were at the events that you're writing about or who knew people that you are writing about. And many organisations have their own libraries, specialist libraries. So consider your subject matters and ask yourself, what organisation may have resources that I could use? Now, an obvious one is Australian War Memorial for anything to do with military history. Their resources are online and on-site. But that's only the beginning. Let me give you some examples from books that I've written in the past. I wrote a series of books on migration, and that saw me using resources from the Immigration Museum. A series of books I wrote on drugs saw me using resources from the Australian Drug Foundation Library. Books I have written on horse racing have seen me using resources from various racing clubs and racing museums. One section of a book that I was writing required me to research early Australian European cuisine, and I found an amazing collection of 1800s cookbooks in the library of a culinary training institution. So think about the not so obvious places that may have information pertinent to your project. If you have not been taught how to research or perhaps haven't done it for a while, the prospect can be daunting. You can become overwhelmed by what you read and panic-stricken about which information to take note of and which to ignore. I'm going to run through my process because I think it'll help you. First, I do what I call a sweep. I gather every book on the subject that I can. I identify as many reputable websites as is manageable, and I bookmark them. I search the newspaper databases, letters, journals. I interview people and get transcripts done. I have all the material that I want ready. And then I start reading. As I read, I ask myself 3 questions about everything I come across. And those 3 questions are, 1, is this essential information? 2, is it important information? And 3, is it interesting or quirky information? If I'm using photocopied materials, I actually use different coloured highlighters, one for each of these criteria. If I'm reading directly from a book or another publication, I make notes about each paragraph, again categorising them. With internet material, you can copy and paste onto documents and highlight with word tools in the same way as highlighters are used. The essential information almost always makes it into my work in some form, and about 50% of the information that I've regarded as important makes it in. The other 50% just doesn't seem so important when I'm doing the writing and the word count is blowing out. Almost all of the interesting or quirky information goes in, even though it hasn't been deemed as being essential or even important. Why? Well, it's because I'm creating a work that is to be read. And I want to ensure that the reader has the most pleasurable reading experience possible. As I've said before, your duty is to the story, and the story needs to be engaging at all times. I use the wow factor to determine if something qualifies under this third criterion. Anything I read that makes me go wow, for whatever reason, gets marked. As I see it, anything that makes me go wow is likely to make readers react in the same way. And it's very important that you carry out this initial highlighting task carefully, because you're going to be left with a great deal of material that has no markings at all. In other words, you deem it not to be either essential or important or quirky. And because your mind turns to what you have marked, it's very rare that you'll even look at that unmarked information again. So if you don't do this process properly, you may well end up leaving stuff aside and never coming back to it. You could always introduce a fourth criterion, which is just a maybe for stuff that you're unsure about, because at least it's highlighted, you'll get back to it. Once you've written a first draft of a chapter or even an entire manuscript, you may find that your word count is way more than you expected or desired. And don't worry, this is totally normal. And when that happens to me, I do the following. Firstly, I give myself a target number to reach, a target number of words that I'm after. And then I just repeat the process I just described, highlighting information that is essential, interesting, or quirky. With the need to reduce word count, it is astonishing how much of what I first thought was essential now is only important, and how much of what I thought was important no longer seems so important. Even some of the quirky information may not appear so now. I then redraft, and if I'm still over my desired word length, I repeat this process again. Of course, the easy option is just to put up with far more words than you want or have deemed to be optimal, but then you're unlikely to create something that a reader will stay with to the end, and you're unlikely to have something that a publisher is going to take on board. Now for 3 final tips on researching. Number 1, take time to do your research. Take time to make decisions. And be flexible about your structure so that you can include anything that comes up in your research that will make for a good story, so long as you can make it relevant, of course. Number 2, make sure you note your sources as you go, not just book titles, but book pages. If possible, make a note of where every piece of information came from. And I speak from horrible experiences here. You will inevitably have to check something, and there seems to be some sort of universal rule that this will usually be something you did not take note of. I have spent days in a library looking for a particular quote from a particular page from a particular book, and it's not fun. And number 3, if your work is going to be published, either by a publisher or self-published, keep all of your notes and other research materials for at least a year after publication. It's amazing how many readers want to query something you've written or ask to know where a particular piece of information came from. Think of aspects of your memoir that you will need to research. Perhaps a historical period, maybe war records. an event that someone in your family has told you about. Now, make an extensive list of where and how you would conduct your research and try and go beyond the obvious. There are many ways to structure a memoir, indeed any work of non-fiction or fiction for that matter. The most obvious and easiest is chronological, the order in which things happened. And when you first start writing, this is probably the safest one to start with. But if you do choose a chronological telling of your story, consider the following 2 points. First, your primary duty is to your story. That means leaving out events that lack conflict or have little bearing on important outcomes. One of my mantras is, just because something happened doesn't make it interesting. So don't put in everything that happened over a certain time, just those that make for a good story. And the second thing is, be flexible. The exact order in which things happen is not nearly as important as what and why things happened and what their consequences are. There are obvious exceptions, such as military campaigns, political events, where the order of events is critical, leading to one big thing at the end. But let's face it, when looking back on our childhoods and coming up with particular memories, we can't expect to get the order right, not even the years sometimes. And in most cases, this doesn't really matter. Place events in an order that creates tension, build-up, suspense, has a climax and a resolution. The elements of a story. An alternative to structuring your work chronologically is to structure it thematically. This involves dealing with aspects of your story when you are dealing with the theme they relate to. And this enables you to place events wherever you like in your overall work. Maybe 3 or 4 of them connect to a particular theme, even if they took place years apart. One of my favourite exercises involving the structure of memoirs and memories will appeal to those of you who remember life before Spotify. Here's a quote from Nick Hornsby's novel, High Fidelity. You've got to kick off with a killer to grab the attention. Then you've got to take it up a notch or cool it off a notch. Oh, there are a lot of rules. Do you know what he's referring to? He's talking about a music album and how they are structured. A great deal of thought used to go into ordering the tracks on an album. You can follow the same thought process with a memoir. I acknowledge the American writer and teacher Daniel Nestor for this connection, and he in turn acknowledges Joan Didion and her collection of writing, The White Album. An album is not ordered according to when the songs were written, but rather to create a pleasurable listening experience. The tone, the shape, they change throughout, sometimes driven by the music, sometimes by the lyrics. Now it's time for you to create your memoir album. Pick 10 memories or stories from your life. Write a few sentences on each, just to get the gist across to yourself. And then, now, think of your memories as tracks of an album and order them in the way you think would make for the best reading experience. Remember, never too much of the same thing. One thing, different thing after another. Now that we've looked at researching and structuring your work, it's time to turn it into the best possible story. If you're confused about my use of the term story, the term applies to both fiction and non-fiction, and the next lesson will give you insights into what makes a great story.